I mentioned 5 from Levine. I will make the classifications just about as plentiful as there are compounds to look at. Because I found that really by the time you get to a new compound, and you begin exploring it, and you find the variation of actions in different people, and you find the type of responses you get to it, you have an individual. You have an individual that is not really, can be compared with other things, but it is not another what have you to be classified as being a footnote underneath a larger classification. Go to the area of the indoles where we're just touching. The basic indoles that have been looked at have been most thoroughly studied in man. Dimethyltryptamine, diethyltryptamine, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, psilocin, psilocybin. These are probably the major ones that are widely known. Totally different from one another. Dimethyltryptamine, the businessman's lunch, as it's been called. It has to be smoked. It has to go in parenterally. You'll eat it, nothing. You have to smoke it, inject it intramuscularly, intravenously, or inhalation, or insufflation, snorting, as it's known in the trade. It's the only way. You've got to get it some way bypassing the gut. It is metabolized. It is destroyed in the normal metabolism of the body. But its action is seen within a minute or two. Its duration is maybe a few minutes. It's a rare person who can milk anything beyond an hour from it. And most people are pretty well satisfied to say that was past tense, an interesting experience, maybe a half an hour. I know one person who managed to go 2.5 hours, but he is a real artist in protracting this state. You put a dimethyltryptamine, DMT. You put a hydroxy group in the 4 position, a simple trivial change, and a material called psilocin, which is also natural material. It's found in mushrooms rather than in the bark of South American plants. It's the so-called magic mushroom active component, psilocin, psilocybin, the genus psilocybe. This is, again, Hoffman had his hand in this, working with Gordon Watson, who died just a few weeks ago, in bringing this out from central Mexico, Oaxaca, and into Western science, both as to the mushroom and to the active component. There's a good example of human experimentation at its very best. Was Hoffman's discovering the active component of the psychedelic mushroom. They brought it back. Haim, who was a mycologist in France, generated all kinds of mycelial growths. He got fruiting bodies. They went back to the original things they brought out of Mexico. They extracted, they put into animals, they put into rats, they put into rabbits, they put into guinea pigs. I don't think they went into dogs. They stayed with the rodents. And they could not find the active component. They made right extracts, left extracts, one thing or another, and nothing showed activity. And of course, the heart of it was active in man. They didn't try it in man. They tried it in rats, mice, guinea pigs, and I believe rabbits. And so Hoffman said, well, obviously this is active. I tasted it. I know it's active. So he chromatographed it into 2 chunks and tasted the 2 chunks. Aha! This is the active chunk. Took it, chromatographed this way up a TLC plate. Each day nibbled another piece of the TLC plate until he found where it was. And in essence, followed the bouncing ball by the simple test of eating, tasting, evaluating, and zeroing in on it was, and isolated psilocybin as being the active component. The thing is, psilocybin is a material that cannot be easily extracted from the mushroom with organic solvents. It happens to be what's called asvitarine. It is extremely salt-like. It's very hard to extract from the plant, and people were looking at extracts and they weren't active. So in essence, he got to the active things by the only test animal that exists in this area, which is the human animal. And that is a good example of the running down of a material. The last of the mushrooms yielded the active material. He synthesized it, published it, and now the material is largely, most of the experimental work is done with material that is synthetic. If the psilocybin's a hard synthesis, psilocin's a much easier one. But psilocybin and psilocin are a rare case where the actual materials are interchangeable in the body. The body converts psilocybin to psilocin, and the two are stoichiometrically identical in the body. You put a methoxy group instead of a hydroxy group in that position, Xango is no longer orally active. One simple addition of 1 carbon, it doesn't go, it has to be smoked again. This is 5-methoxy-DMT, probably another one of the major studied psychedelics of the Indo area. Smoking, injection, intramuscular, intravenous. I don't know of any other route it's gone in. If the DMT is a businessman's lunch, this is a businessman's coffee break. It active in a very few seconds, totally effective within a minute, and to a large measure, largely dissipated at perhaps 10, 15 minutes. Psychologically, the bell continues ringing for quite a while. It carries quite an impact, and there have been some very intense, I think it's about as good a word as I can use, intense experiences that I'm aware of, where it's been used clinically, in which the person is physically at a baseline within an hour, and psychologically is still dealing with that which has emerged from his unconscious for a matter of days and even weeks. So the problem, it's a long-lived thing at a psychological level, but in the body it is rapidly destroyed in the body. You take the two methyl groups and replace them with two isopropyl groups, it becomes orally active again. It becomes a very delightful, silly little intoxicant with almost no consequence. It doesn't have the impact of a psychedelic in causing you to dig deeply into your psyche and unravel all that junk that's buried there. You kind of go out and get a little loaded and a little happy and enjoy the movie. I mean, there's not all of these carry the impact of the coming second coming. I mean, some of these are really basically mild intoxicants. Some of them are uncomfortable intoxicants. Some will cause, I know one material that I had great hopes for, it turns out 50% of the people who try it get wildly nauseous. Well, it's one where the body, this is a matter of one of my sulfur compounds, 2CT2, is a very, very intense nausea producer in about half the people, and they just can't handle it. Others can handle it very well and think it's marvelous. Well, it's a faulted compound in the sense that it has not a totally predictable type of action. It's in the phenethylamines. Let me talk about the phenethylamines a little bit. The phenethylamines, the prototype of the phenethylamines is mescaline. It's the alkaloid that is found in the peyote cactus, the little dumpling cactus that used to grow wild in Chihuahua and southern Mexico, or southern Texas, until they found that they could pull it up by the root and eat the root too, and it's being rapidly stripped from the fields. I'm sad to say. It's being very, very rapidly cleared out of its native habitat. But it did, and it still can be found in Chihuahua and in Texas. The dumpling mushroom grows in nature to about 2 inches in dumpling cactus grows to about 2 inches in diameter. It is without spines. It has little tufts. It's named Lophophora from the tufts it carries. And its main active component is mescaline, a very simple phenethylamine. And you'll still find in the major textbooks the only active phenethylamine in this entire area. Because phenethylamines are known to be destroyed in the body. They are subjects to an enzyme system that destroys amines. One of our big protecting agents is an enzyme system called monoamine oxidase. It's an enzyme that gets rid of amines such as mescaline. It happens not to touch mescaline for reasons that are not totally clear. So mescaline survives, but it takes hundreds of milligrams of mescaline to get an effective experience. Typical dosage, 300, 400, 500 milligrams of the actual cactus, maybe 6 or 8 or 10 of the cacti is necessary to get a full psychedelic experience. And since this is the only phenethylamine that was known to be active, and since phenethylamines are known to be rapidly destroyed, the statement is made that there are no active phenethylamines other than mescaline. Well, I can say that's not exactly so. I know of perhaps 150 that are active, and they are, interestingly enough, many of them much more potent. They are interestingly enough not particularly attacked by monoamine oxidase. It's almost as if that enzyme system had its own territory to work on, and it largely works on stimulants, and does not particularly work on psychedelics. I don't know why, but it just happens to draw these little lines in its own metabolic decision on what to be effective. So really, mescaline was my earliest point of departure. My first psychedelic experience was an experience with mescaline many, many years ago, over almost 3 decades ago, in which I had 400 milligrams of mescaline, and I had a rather impressive experience. And it brought one thing very vividly to mind that I've never been able to forget in the course of 30 years. And that is what I saw and what I experienced and what I realized in the course of that 8 hours was so marvelously complex and to me so fundamentally important. I realized it was absolutely physically impossible. It was silly. It was nonsensical to believe that a little white solid with about 22 carbons and maybe a few more hydrogens and 1 nitrogen and 3 oxygens could have carried that impact of a message. The message, the trip, the experience, what I learned had to have come out of here. And all that chemical did was catalyze its release. And if I can get that kind of release, what else is in there? What else is there to be learned from within yourself? What has been tucked in there? Nice to say, oh, maybe it's been over the millennia of past years. I don't know. But there's an awful lot in there that I have found myself absolutely fascinated with. I have found that there are catalysts that can release it in different ways. There are catalysts that are inconsistent, and there are catalysts that are consistent. So I started with mescaline as a starting point. What would happen if, I was trying to explain at dinner tonight that chemistry is really delightful because it's the only exact art. It is an art because you can take a molecule you can't see that in itself probably has only a statistical chance of even being there, take off a group and plop on another group with consummate art, and then you do it to 10 to the 20th of these molecules and taste what happens. and you know, you have made a new material, you've made a new molecule, and it's a total unknown. You can't visualize, you can't imagine the excitement of having a white solid that's never been made before. You know what it is, but you don't know what it does. And you realize you can put it into an animal, put enough in an animal, you're going to kill an animal. And really, killing an animal doesn't turn me on that much. I see no reason of running LD50s. I've never really understood the virtue of killing half of the animals you have, just to get a number that goes into a report. And so really, the test animal's man. So you know you're going to taste that compound. You know how much to start with. That's an interesting approach. The whole philosophy goes into the first dosage. But if you stop and think for a moment, that compound does not have a property, because no one's tasted it. So you are in an interesting dialogue, in that you are going to not discover what a property is in the compound. It doesn't have a property. You can't discover what's not there. You're in a dialogue in that you are going to begin developing an agreement of what response you are going to have to the compound. And as you develop that agreement, you come in, you get a little surprise, a little nudge comes in from the right you weren't expecting. All right, it has its personality too, and you're not going to be totally in charge of the show. But on the other hand, you can also add your little thoughts to it. And the beauty of being able to give property to a compound is you stop thinking you can't be wrong. Because once you've given the property of the compound, look what other people do. They try the compound, they say, hey, he's right. You're confirmed. Or they'll say, hey, he's wrong. Where did I go wrong? And you're confirmed. So either way, you know, what you give it as a sense of that, as the property of that compound, will in essence belong as agreement to you and to it. And I believe there is it sounds a little bit perhaps mystical. It sounds awfully mystical. But that's all right. It doesn't bother me in the slides. If it bothers you, we'll discuss it. Right. But it is a way in which you find this rapport, and it is a marvelous, marvelous area of exploration. It's truly an art, and it's an area that I have found in the 30 years to be totally exciting. So I took mescaline. I said, here's mescaline. It wants a carbon to be a substituted amphetamine. Let's put a carbon on it. So, you know, out comes the crazy glue, and on goes the methyl group, and you've got yourself a trimethoxyamphetamine material, which I call TMA, trimethoxyamphetamine. It turned out to be a very bad choice of nomenclature. At the time, I was enraptured with alphabet soup. I kept giving letters to everything. And everything ended with an A, because I was making Humpty Dumpty's tri-substituted amphetamine. And I thought, after all, the chain skeletons, amphetamine, never occurred to me that amphetamine was a buzzword that would really trigger people's negative responses, because these materials are not stimulants. But they do have amphetamine as a basic chain. And so trimethoxyamphetamine was a substituted amphetamine. And it had an interesting, it was a very good example to me of the fine, subtle differences that occur between compounds. With mescaline, I would look at a rose. In fact, the dining room table had, the coffee table, had a just blooming rose on it, which I found to be one of the most unbelievably colored things. The mescaline has this property of enhancing color distinction. Probably one of its greatest sense modalities is the sense of color. I looked at this with absolute awe, absolute love, absolute disbelief that something of such simplicity could have such a complex color, structure, past, present, and future. I mean, you're into this thing you're really into it. I was amazed with it. I couldn't even touch it. To touch it was to modify it from the way it was. About a week and a half later, it was trimethoxyamphetamine. Much of the color was still there. I could take that rose and take it apart, completely destroy it. There was none of this empathy, none of this subtle, you cannot touch it. With mescaline, it was able to dissect. And actually, early in the experiments with the early research group, we found 2 or 3 instances of almost aggressive, all on the edge of pathological aggression being expressed. It was intoxicating in a different way. It released a different point of view. You saw something, but in a analytical and an impersonal way. Whereas with mescaline, you saw it in a very sympathetic and a very empathic way. Differences of just with one carbon atom. Gosh, if one carbon atom, but let's put on 2. So bang in the more crazy glue, and on goes another methyl group, and I got a two methyl group hanging down there, totally inactive. And I took more, took as much as I dared, began getting pain in the kidneys, no action. So it turns out to be alpha-ethylmescaline has no activity at all. It was about 5 or 10 years later that I completed the circle on that, and I discovered it was really